The wind came down from the mountains, sharp as a blade, cutting through the empty valley where snow and dust mingled in uneasy truce. The sky was a pale bruise, neither day nor night, and the sun hung like a dull coin above the farthest ridge. On the platform of the broken-down station stood a woman, her thin coat drawn tight, her gloved hands trembling against the letter she carried. The paper had been folded and unfolded too many times. Its edges had gone soft as cloth. The words inside were few, written in a hand that spoke of haste, of duty more than affection. "Send her," it had said. "I'll take her for $1, same as agreed." There had been no name at the bottom, only a crude signature and a promise that she'd be met in the town of Dry Creek before the first thaw. She had imagined him a dozen ways during the long train ride west, a rough man perhaps, shoulders bent with work, hands scarred from rope and plow. She'd tried not to hope for kindness. Hope, she had learned, was a fragile thing in the cold. The train had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the ghost of its steam. Around her stretched a town that barely breathed, a few wooden buildings sagging under the weight of frost, smoke curling from one chimney, and the echo of a dog's bark somewhere far off. No one came forward. No one spoke her name. She stood until her legs ached, until the numbness began to creep into her feet. Then she walked, slow and cautious, along the frozen street. The sound of her boots was the only thing moving in that still world. At the edge of town, a man on horseback appeared tall, wrapped in a long coat the color of dust and earth. His hat brim shadowed his eyes, and snow gathered in the folds of his scarf. When he dismounted, she saw the careful way he moved, as though each motion was considered before it was made. "You're Miss Carter," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. She nodded once. Her throat was too dry for words. He looked at her with something like pity, or perhaps surprise. "Name's Eli Ward. I reckon you're here for the agreement." The word hung between them, agreement, as cold and unfeeling as the air. She managed a whisper. "Yes." He nodded again, slower this time, and glanced toward the wagon waiting near the hitching post. "We best get moving. It's near sundown, and the pass ice is over fast." The road out of town wound through canyons where the wind howled like something alive. The wagon creaked, the horse's breath rising in plumes of white. She sat beside him, her hands clasped tight in her lap. He didn't speak much, only pointed out the ridges, the riverbed, the path they'd take once the snows melted. As darkness settled, they reached the ranch. It was smaller than she had pictured, a single cabin, a barn leaning against the wind, a fence half buried in drifts. But a lamp burned in the window, soft and steady, and the sight of it sent a quiet tremor through her chest. Inside, warmth hit her like mercy. The fire crackled, throwing orange light across rough-hewn walls and a wooden table scarred by years of use. Eli took off his coat, hung it on a peg, then turned to her as though uncertain what came next. "I suppose you'll want to rest," he said. "I'll work," she replied quickly. "I don't take charity." His gaze softened, almost a smile. "Didn't say you did. There's stew on the stove. Eat first." She hesitated but obeyed. The broth was thin, but it was hot, and she could not remember the last time she'd tasted warmth that way. He sat across from her, silent, his hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The firelight drew deep shadows across his face, carving him into something older than his years. After a while, he spoke again. "I didn't expect them to send you so soon. Thought maybe you'd change your mind." She looked at him then, truly looked at the faint scar along his jaw, the weariness in his eyes, the way he seemed half apologetic for his own existence. "There was nothing left to change my mind from," she said quietly. For a long time neither spoke. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls like a restless spirit, and the rafters creaked in reply. When he finally rose, he handed her a folded blanket. "You can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." She wanted to protest, but the words wouldn't come. Exhaustion had settled deep into her bones. She lay down fully clothed, the blanket rough but blessedly warm. Through half-lidded eyes, she watched him tend the fire, his silhouette outlined in gold. There was something in the way he moved, careful, deliberate, like a man who had known loss and learned to tread gently around the living. And as the flames crackled low, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that maybe the silence around her wasn't empty after all. Morning came gray and brittle. She woke to the sound of kindling catching, the faint sigh of flame drawing breath. Her body felt heavy as wet wool, but the warmth called her back from the dark. Eli moved about with a quietness that seemed bred into him, boots soft on the plank floor, the smell of coffee rising like a promise. She sat up, and the blanket slid from her shoulders, the room cold on the strip of skin at her wrist where the glove had rubbed her raw. He handed her a tin mug without ceremony. Steam licked her face. The first swallow scalded, and she welcomed it. Pain meant the day had begun. He set a bowl of porridge in front of her, and she ate until the ache in her stomach eased. Work started before the light took hold. The door cried open and the cold came in, a living thing. She followed him to the well where the rope was a stiff snake, the bucket mouth frozen into a rim of glass. He showed her how to break the crust with the wooden dipper, how to brace her feet against the slick boards and haul hand over hand. The rope burned her palms through the threadbare gloves, and a sting like needles climbed her fingers. She did not complain. When the bucket topped the curb, she bore its weight, water slapping her skirt, ankles numb to the bone. At the barn, they chipped ice from the trough, the little horse nosing close, breath sweet with hay. Eli moved gently with the animal, palm to its cheek, voice as low as a prayer. She watched the way the creature leaned into him, trusting. You could tell the truth of a man by how beasts met him. She put that away like a fact she might need. By noon, her arms shook. She gathered fallen branches from the cottonwoods along the riverbed, broke them across her knee, stacked them by the wall. Eli said little, but his eyes kept finding her, measuring what she could manage, not judging it. Once, when he returned from the pasture, he handed her a pair of old mittens, wool worn thin at the cuffs. "My mother made these," he said, like he was offering a family story along with the thread. She slipped them on and felt heat seep into her bones. In the pause after chores, he sat at the table with a small box. From it he drew a fiddle, the wood honey dark and scarred along the chin rest. He ran a cloth across the strings and tuned by ear, his face turned a little, as if the note he sought was somewhere beyond the wall. He played only a scrap of melody, thin as creek water in drought, but it unlatched something in her chest. Music belonged to rooms where people were wanted, where voices rose and settled together. She looked away and wrapped her hands tighter around the cup. The letter in her pocket grew heavier by the hour. It had traveled farther than she had, through hands she did not know, carrying a promise she did not choose. She remembered the parlor, where the arrangement had been put before her like an extra chair. The orphan matron's voice had been dry as paper. "Think of a roof, child. Think of food you did not beg. Think how the world makes wives as it makes nails, in bulk and for use." She had looked at the floorboards and pictured the West as a clean slate of wind, where no one knew her failures, where her name would not bring the wrong questions. She had not pictured the number in the letter, that small, hard word for what a life cost. $1. She told herself that measure belonged to the sender, not to her blood. Still, at night, the figure rose like a brand. Eli kept to the edges of things, as if giving her room to figure the shape of her days. When he did speak, the words held care like a hidden seam. The land was his inheritance, he told her, though inheritance felt grander than what lay outside the window. His father had driven posts with his bare hands. His mother had planted a line of cottonwoods to break the wind and sang hymns when storms bowed the roof. After they were gone, his younger brother had ridden fence with him until a fever took the boy in spring, quick and mean as fire through grass. Eli said this without adornment. Then he rose, checked the latch, and brought in more wood. The rhythm of the place took hold. She learned to bake coarse bread in the Dutch oven, to skim the gray scum from stew, to mend Eli's shirt where it had split under the arm. She hammered a bent hinge straight with a rock, feeling a small pride at the way it fell true again. In the evenings, she swept the floor and listened to the wind ride the chimney. Now and then, Eli would take down a thin book from a shelf near the door and read a page under his breath. Once, she asked what it was. "Sermons," he said, "from a preacher his mother favored." He did not press the book into her hands, and she was grateful. Sometimes kindness felt heavier than hunger. Word of her would travel. She knew that. Men who wrote and traded in such agreements liked to watch what came of them. Women in town would guess at her value, at what had been paid. She stood at the window and watched the light crawl across the drifts. She tried out the thought that even if a number had crossed a man's palm for her passage, it did not fix her worth. She tried to set that thought like a fence post, tamped hard. Some days it stood. Some days the wind pushed through. In the blue hour before dark, Eli came in with his hat rim glazed white. "You did well," he said. Simple words, nothing tied to them, but they landed with the weight of a hand on the shoulder. She felt her throat close. "Thank you," she managed. He looked almost shy then, as if praise were a private thing he feared he had misused. He stepped aside, letting her pass at the door, and the courtesy taught her more about him than any story might. That night she dreamed of a train pulling away, and of herself stepping down before it ever stopped, walking out to meet a life that did not know her name yet. When she woke, the fire had fallen to coals, and the room held the sweet, tired hush of a house that has earned its sleep. She lay listening to Eli's breathing near the hearth. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote marked the ridge, and the mares shifted in their stalls. She whispered, as if the rafters could carry it, "I am not a number." The words felt rough and real in her mouth, like bread crust torn by hand. Snow melted slow that spring, reluctant to leave the high country. Rivulets trickled through the pasture, carving narrow scars in the earth. The land woke in shades of brown and gray before any green dared show itself. Each morning, Clara walked the fence line with Eli, learning where the wire sagged, where frost had bent the posts. Her hands, once delicate from years of mending linens and scrubbing floors, grew strong. She found pride in that, in the calluses forming like armor, in the ache that came not from fear or hunger, but from honest work. Eli spoke more now, though never much at once. His words came like seeds scattered in good soil few, but they took root. He told her about the colt he'd tried to break the year his brother died, how it had thrown him and left him limping for months. About the drought that followed, when he nearly sold the ranch but couldn't bring himself to let the land go. "This ground's got bones in it," he'd said, eyes tracing the horizon. "My kin's bones. Seems wrong to leave it for dust." She listened. Sometimes she asked questions. Sometimes she didn't. There was comfort in the quiet, the kind that made words unnecessary. Still, she learned to read the turns of his face, the way his jaw set when he worried, how his fingers tapped the table when he was thinking. She knew the rhythm of his breath before storms, the soft hum he made when working a rope knot, the small things a person reveals when they've stopped trying to hide. Evenings settled slow. They ate together in silence, then she'd patch a tear in his coat or hem one of his worn shirts while he cleaned his rifle. The lamplight fell between them like a fragile truce. Once, he caught her humming a tune she hadn't realized escaped her, and she froze, needle in midair. "My mother used to hum that," he said, almost to himself. "You have her voice." She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. But that night she found herself humming again, quietly, as if to fill the room with something that belonged to neither of them and both. By April, they'd settled into a rhythm that almost felt like peace. The snow thinned, the river swelled, and the sky deepened to the color of tin. Eli began to take her along to market in town. Folks stared, at first whispers curling behind her back like smoke. She kept her chin level, her hands still. A woman at the store counter muttered something about mail-order wives, and Eli's shoulders tightened, but he said nothing. He placed his goods on the counter, paid in coins worn smooth by use, and when they left, he tipped his hat to the woman like she'd said nothing cruel at all. Outside, Clara couldn't hold her silence. "You don't have to—" "I know," he said, his tone soft but steady. "But I reckon I'd rather keep my temper than prove it to the likes of her." They walked back to the wagon. A wind rose off the plains, carrying the smell of thawing earth. He helped her up his hand, rough, steady, and for the first time she didn't pull away too quickly. In the weeks that followed, warmth crept back into the valley. The cottonwoods along the creek unfurled new leaves, tender and trembling. The house seemed less empty with the windows open, laughter from the yard drifting inside like something half forgotten. Once, while Eli mended a harness, Clara baked bread, real bread, with yeast and patience, and when it came out golden and fragrant, he looked at her with something she hadn't seen before. Not gratitude, not surprise, something quieter, deeper, as though the sight of that loaf, plain and perfect, had undone a long-held grief. That night, after supper, he brought her a gift, a small wooden box, sanded smooth and lined with a scrap of blue cloth. Inside lay a brooch, silver, tarnished, shaped like a flower. "Belonged to my mother," he said. "I reckon she'd have wanted you to have it." She traced the metal petals with her fingertip, unable to speak. When she looked up, his gaze was steady but shy. "You don't owe me this," she murmured. "It's not about owing," he said simply. "It's about what fits." She turned the brooch in her hand, feeling the weight of it, and something inside her eased, not a burst of joy, but a loosening like thawing ice. Later, when he'd gone outside to tend the horses, she stood by the window and pinned the brooch to her collar. The firelight caught the edge of it, turning it warm. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass. The woman staring back had changed. Not prettier, not softer, but more certain somehow. The prairie had marked her, but it had not taken her. Outside, Eli's silhouette moved against the dim horizon, steady and alone. She watched him until the light faded, then whispered to the empty room, "I'll stay." The words hung in the air, quiet as prayer, but they felt real, truer than any vow made before a crowd. Summer came sudden and hard, burning away the last of the snow. The river ran wild for a week, muddy and swollen, carrying branches and memory down its course. The grass grew high, horses sleeked their coats, and heat shimmered over the plain like a ghost dance. Eli rose before dawn each morning, his shadow moving against the red light, while Clara tended the hearth. She had learned to meet the day as the land did, without complaint, without expectation, simply taking what came. They worked side by side, mending fence, branding calves, bringing in hay. Her shoulders ached, her back hardened. Sweat ran down her spine, salt on her lips, dust in her lungs. She'd never known labor that left her this bone-tired yet proud. At night, when she lay in bed, her muscles hummed as though they were still in motion. Sometimes she dreamt of water running through her hands, cool, endless, and woke with tears drying on her cheeks. One evening, thunder rolled far off, deep as the voice of something ancient. Eli stood by the door, scanning the sky, his brow furrowed. "We'll need to bring the herd in before it breaks," he said. She followed him without question. The storm came fast, black clouds tearing across the horizon. The air turned thick, electric. Rain hit like gravel. They shouted over the roar, driving the cattle toward shelter. Lightning split the ridge, and for a heartbeat, the world turned white. The smell of singed air filled her nose. A steer bolted from the pen. Eli went after it, his horse skidding in the mud. Clara ran too, skirts heavy, breath burning. The animal thrashed near the creek, trapped in the rising water. Eli dismounted, rope in hand, fighting the pull of the current. "Stay back," he yelled, but she waded in anyway, gripping his arm. Together they hauled until their legs went numb, until the steer stumbled free and climbed the bank. By the time they reached the cabin, soaked and shaking, night had swallowed the plains. Inside, the fire was dead. They stripped off wet clothes, modest in silence, hanging garments by the hearth. Eli's hands trembled as he struck the match. When the flame caught, his face came into view, pale, lips blue with cold. She stepped closer, pressed a blanket to his shoulders. He didn't move away. "I told you to stay back," he said softly. "You'd have drowned," she answered, her voice hoarse. He looked at her then, truly looked, as if seeing the full shape of her for the first time. The space between them was filled with the smell of rain and smoke. His hand came up, hesitated, then brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. She didn't flinch. For once, she didn't feel small or beholden, only alive. He stepped away first, clearing his throat. "You're a stubborn woman, Clara." "So are you, Eli." The smallest smile touched his mouth. It was enough to light the room brighter than the fire. Days passed, and the storm became a story the valley would whisper about, a flood that nearly took the herd, a woman who waded in after a rancher. In town, tongues wagged sharper than knives. She bought herself a husband for $1, someone said at the mercantile. Now she's trying to own him too. Eli heard it, but he didn't rise to it. Clara saw how his jaw tightened as they walked out. On the ride home, silence hung heavy. When they reached the ridge, she laid a hand on his arm. "Let them talk," she said. "The land knows who we are." He turned to her, and something eased in his face. "Aye," he said, "the land does." By midsummer, the ranch began to change. They built a new chicken coop together, patched the roof, planted rows of corn behind the barn. Eli started carving small figures in the evenings: horses, birds, a woman's face half finished. He never said it was her, but she knew. Sometimes she'd hum while he carved, and he'd nod along, matching the rhythm with the scrape of his knife. They spoke little of love, yet it lived there in the ordinary things: the way he filled her cup before his own, the way she waited at the window when he rode out late. Still, peace was never left untested. Late that season, a rider came from town carrying a letter. It bore the seal of the agency that had arranged the marriage. The man tipped his hat, handed it to Eli, and rode off without a word. Clara stood by the doorway, her heart turning cold. Eli read in silence. His expression didn't shift, but his knuckles whitened around the page. When he finished, he folded it carefully, set it on the table, and stared at the wall. "What is it?" she asked. He hesitated. "They're claiming you weren't delivered lawfully. There's some dispute about the papers, the payment. Says you might still belong to another contract." The words struck like ice water. "Belong," she whispered. "To who?" "Some man in Street Lewis. Claims he sent for you first." The room went still. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane, a dry, mournful sound. "I won't go," she said finally. Her voice was low, steady. "Whatever I was, I'm not that now." Eli met her gaze, and for the first time she saw fear in his eyes, not of losing her, but of not being able to protect her. He reached across the table, took her hand. "Then we'll fight it," he said. His grip was rough, warm, sure. For the first time since stepping off that train, she felt something close to home. The following days passed under a weight heavier than any storm. The letter sat on the table like a curse neither dared to touch again. Eli sent word to the sheriff in Dry Creek, then to a man in Denver who knew the law. Each letter cost more than they could spare, and still Clara said nothing. She rose early, worked late, cooked and mended and carried water, as though labor could drown her dread. But in the dark, when Eli's breathing turned slow beside the dying fire, she lay awake, listening to the wind scratch at the walls like an animal begging entrance. Rumor reached them before the official reply. A man named Samuel Harker had ridden west. He was said to be a merchant, older, rich, with a taste for buying what could not be freely given. He'd seen Clara's likeness once, in a photograph meant for another, and claimed her as his. Her stomach turned when Eli spoke the name. She remembered only the shadow of that parlor back east, the matron's hand on her shoulder, the papers she'd signed with eyes lowered. She'd thought the contract gone, forgotten under new ink. But the past had a way of finding its way through any fence. Eli tried to keep her spirits. "We'll sort this," he said. "Ain't no man can claim another human being." But she could hear the tremor beneath his calm. He'd seen the way the world bent its laws for wealth, how words on paper could bind tighter than rope. By August, the heat cracked the land open. The sky turned white, the fields brittle. They rode into town together when the sheriff called, both dressed in their best, though Eli's shirt still bore the faint stains of work. The sheriff was a tired man with whiskey on his breath. He read the letter aloud in a flat tone. "Harker's en route," he said. "Claims breach of contract. Says the woman is his by lawful right." Eli's jaw tightened. "She's nobody's but her own." The sheriff sighed. "You know how it goes. If he's got papers and a judge to back him, it'll come down to proof. You got any proof of payment, of consent?" Eli shook his head. "Wasn't much to prove. Just a letter and $1 sent through the agency." Clara's voice broke through then, quiet but clear. "If law's what he wants, let him bring it. I'll not run." The sheriff looked at her long, perhaps pitying her courage, perhaps admiring it. "Then you'd best be ready, ma'am. That man won't come alone." They rode home in silence. The sky was vast and merciless. At the ridge, Eli stopped the horse, staring out over the valley that had once seemed theirs alone. "If you wanted to go," he said at last, "I wouldn't hold it against you." She turned to him, anger rising sharp and clean. "You think I came all this way to flee again?" He met her gaze, and something in him broke open, not weakness, but the surrender of a man who'd carried too much alone. "Then we'll face him together," he said. When Harker arrived, the valley went still. His carriage rolled up the track like a dark insect, the wheels cutting the dry earth. He stepped down in a coat too fine for the dust, his face red from drink and pride. Two men rode behind him, hands resting easy on their gun belts. Eli stood on the porch, rifle across his arm. Clara came out beside him, her dress plain, her hair tied back. Harker's eyes swept over her with the hunger of possession. "So," he said, his voice slick, "you've made yourself comfortable." "I've made myself free," she answered. He laughed, a harsh sound. "Freedom bought on another man's coin. You'll come with me, girl. The contract stands." Eli took one step forward. "You'll turn around now, Harker. Leave the lady be." Harker smirked. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but dirt and pride, rancher. I'll have the law on my side before the week's out." Eli's voice was low. "The law's a long ride from here." The men behind Harker shifted in their saddles, tension tightening the air. Clara felt her pulse hammer. She stepped between them before Eli could move. Her voice trembled, but her eyes did not. "You want to claim me?" she said. "Then hear me claim myself first." She reached into her pocket and drew out the brooch Eli's mother had given her. The silver caught the light, burning bright. "This is all I was given freely," she said, "and it's all I need. You may keep your paper. It's worth less than the dust on my boots." For a moment, silence hung. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Eli spoke, each word slow and sure. "You heard her." Harker's mouth twisted. He took one step toward them, and Eli raised the rifle. The motion was calm, final. "I said, you heard her." Something in Eli's eyes made Harker stop. Pride met its match in the quiet of that stare. After a long, cold moment, he turned away, spat into the dirt, and climbed back into his carriage. The wheels groaned as they rolled off down the track, shrinking into the horizon. Only when the sound had vanished did Eli lower the gun. He looked at Clara then, his face pale with what he'd almost done. She stepped close, placed a hand over his. "It's finished," she whispered. He nodded once, unable to speak. That night the wind turned soft again. They sat together on the porch, watching the stars bleed through the dark. No words passed between them, but something deeper than speech had been spoken. The next morning, he built a small cross of cedar and planted it near the gate, not for a grave, but as a mark of something survived. She stood beside him, her hand finding his without thought. The world was still vast and hard, but for the first time, it did not feel empty. Autumn crept in quiet as a memory. The fields browned, the air turned sharp, and every sound seemed to carry farther across the valley. The days shortened, yet the light softened, spilling through the cottonwoods in gold threads that clung to everything they touched. Clara rose before dawn still, but her steps felt different now, no longer the tread of a stranger learning the land, but of someone who belonged to it. The house bore signs of their work together. A new roof sealed tight against the wind. Shelves filled with jars of pickled beans and peaches. Tools hung neat along the wall. These small proofs of labor became the language between them. They didn't speak often of what had passed Harker's visit, the threat, the fear that had coiled around their nights, but it lived beneath their silence like a shared heartbeat. Sometimes Eli would reach across the table, brush his thumb against her wrist, and that small touch said what neither dared give voice to. We endured. As the first frost came, she began to help him ready the land for winter. They cut wood, mended the barn roof, salted meat. One afternoon, while Eli worked the fence by the creek, she took to the hill above the house, gathering fallen branches. The air was crisp enough to sting her lungs. Below her, the ranch spread wide, the cabin, the corral, the glint of water running low and sure. For the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she saw it not as a prison of survival, but as something living, something that had been waiting for her. When she returned, Eli was in the yard, hat in hand, watching the sky. "Storm coming," he said. "You can smell it." She could that strange sweetness before snow, the hush that fell over animals and earth alike. Together they worked faster, stacking the last of the firewood. When the storm broke that night, it came not with fury but with grace, wide flakes drifting soundless through the dark. Inside, they sat close by the hearth. Eli carved while she mended a tear in his coat. The fire threw shadows that wove together on the wall, two figures becoming one. After a time, he set his knife down. "I got a letter from Denver," he said quietly. Harker dropped his claim. The agency folded. "There'll be no more letters." Her hands stilled. Relief flooded her, fierce and trembling. "It's over then." He nodded. "It's over." She looked into the fire and felt tears burn the back of her eyes. Not the wild, desperate kind she'd shed in the train car months ago, but the kind that washed something clean. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For standing with me." He shook his head, gaze soft. "You stood just as tall." For a long while they listened to the snow against the roof, the kind of quiet that held more comfort than any words. Then Eli reached into his pocket and drew out a small ring, simple silver, worn smooth. "Was my mother's," he said. "Never figured I'd have cause to use it again. But maybe," his voice faltered, "maybe it's time it belonged to someone living." She stared at the ring not for its worth, but for the story it carried. He didn't kneel or make ceremony. He only offered it, rough fingers open, waiting. Her answer came in the way she placed her hand in his, steady as breath. "Yes," she said. One word, small but strong enough to fill the room. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been waiting all along. Winter deepened. They settled into a rhythm that was half work, half wonder. Each morning she woke to the smell of coffee, to the creak of his boots on the floorboards. Sometimes he'd find her humming by the window, eyes on the pale sky, and he'd stop just to listen. They didn't need to speak of love. It was stitched into every shared task, every quiet evening by the fire. In January, when the first calf was born early, they worked side by side through the freezing dark, coaxing the small, slick body into the world. When the creature finally stood, trembling and alive, Eli laughed a sound she had never heard from him before, raw and joyful. She laughed too, and the sound of it filled the barn like sunlight. Later, as they walked back to the cabin, the snow glowed faintly under the moon. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "You ever think," he said softly, "how strange it is, all the things that had to go wrong just to bring you here?" She smiled, eyes on the horizon. Maybe nothing went wrong at all. They reached the porch, the lantern throwing long light over the drifted snow. From inside came the faint cry of the calf, strong and new. She turned to him then, the cold painting her breath silver. $1, she said, half laughing, half weeping. "That's what they said I was worth." Eli brushed his thumb over her cheek, gentle as falling snow. "Then the world's been short-changed." He kissed her once, slow and certain, and when they parted, the silence that followed was not emptiness but home. The storm passed by morning. The sun rose pale and clean over the valley, lighting the cottonwoods like glass. In the corral, the calf stumbled after its mother, unsteady but alive. From the doorway, Clara watched them, her hands folded over the ring on her finger. The wind moved through the grass, whispering against the fence posts like a blessing. She smiled, small and certain. The land had taken her measure and found her strong. What began as a bargain had become something holy, a life built from endurance, trust, and the quiet miracle of being seen.